In your book, you start with the War of 1812 and James Madison. Take us through to Lyndon Baines Johnson, basically, and the different presidents as they went to war, how they decided, how they conducted it. Talk for a moment about deciding not to go to war, because President Trump says he's avoided a war. How important has that been, and has there been any pattern to presidents' decisions in that regard?
Well, sometimes the greatest presidents are those who keep us from going into war. As I write about in the book, Dwight Eisenhower in the mid-1950s was urged by a lot of people after the French collapsed in Vietnam to fill the vacuum, get involved in the war in Vietnam. He had the wisdom to avoid it. Lyndon Johnson, as you know very well, did not a decade later. But one of the scoops I've got in the book is that I discovered that in 1968, LBJ was asked by his commander in Vietnam, William Westmoreland, who said, why don't we use nuclear weapons to finish off this war and achieve a victory? And LBJ, to his great credit, although he had made so many mistakes in Vietnam, said, absolutely not. We're not moving nuclear weapons to Vietnam. Had you not had a leader of Johnson's wisdom and judgment, at least at that moment, you could have had this civil war in Vietnam turn nuclear. The Russians and Chinese could have come in. There could have been tens of millions of human beings killed.
Yeah, and of course, President Truman, as I recall, made a similar decision not to follow Douglas MacArthur's recommendation and invade China at one point in the Korean conflict. One of the things that was fascinating about your book, actually, was the number of times through history that we've ended up in a war without Congress declaring it, despite the fact that that's what the Constitution required. Has that been reacting to basically the difference in how we conduct business? It's so much more instantaneous today. It's not like the 18th century.
That's one of the reasons, but the other reason is that presidents want to escape responsibility. I love Harry Truman, but in 1950, when the North Koreans invaded the South, Truman's people said, well, of course, you will do what presidents normally do, which is to go to Congress, ask for a war declaration. And I've got it from, the notes that were taken in these private meetings. Truman says, I'm not going to do that because I've got midterms coming up in a couple of months. I don't want a big debate that might be embarrassing to me. I'm just going to do this war on my own and just say that our war in Korea is going to be a police action under the United Nations. That was a really bad example because, a decade and a half after that, when Lyndon Johnson was thinking about war in Vietnam, he goes to the public and claims that there was an unprovoked, he said, attack on a U.S. ship in the Gulf of Tonkin off North Vietnam. He got Congress to give him this Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Turns out there was never any such attack. Yet, Johnson and Nixon used that resolution to run a war in Vietnam for 10 years, almost 60,000 Americans killed. That's not the way it's supposed to be.
Well, and do we lose something in that process, Michael, do you think? And that is in terms of really making sure the nation's behind it. I mean, at various times in our history, we've ended up in wars that doesn't have the support. And I think even of President Trump saying that that there would have been a war with North Korea, it's not clear to me that the American people had addressed that question and decided, yes, we're willing to go to war over nuclear weapons in North Korea.
Yeah, exactly. What you want is a president who will go to Congress and explain why the nation should go to war, how long it might take, how many casualties there might be. Franklin Roosevelt made some big mistakes in World War II. Japanese internment, I think he could have done more to thwart the Holocaust. Yet, when he went to Congress and got Congress to agree to that war, he essentially said this could take years, we may have many setbacks, but we have no choice because unless we fight, we may be in a hostile world that may lead to the death of the United States as we know it.
At the same time, if you go all the way back to 1807, the nature of war itself has changed over time. I mean, we now have, special operators going behind enemy lines, and we don't have the traditional troops. For that matter, we have economic warfare. Although one of the things I really noticed in your book was Thomas Jefferson avoided that War of 1812 for a while by an embargo that basically didn't work.
Right, which would, I'm sure, not nominating an embargo in the one he did in 1807 as the solution to any of this, and that may have some bearing on modern times too, David. But the thing is that in Jefferson's case, there were a lot of big political dividends for him to go to war against the British in 1807. He could have done it, yet he had the leadership to say, this is the wrong thing to do. I worry in modern times that you might have a president who is tempted to go to war to raise his poll ratings or maybe win an election. President Trump, before he was president in 2011, wrongly accused President Obama in a number of tweets saying, Barack Obama will go to war to win the 2012 election. Not a good idea to have in the head of any president.
Through history, have economic sanctions ever worked to avoid warfare? Because goodness knows we have a lot of economic sanctions kicking around right now, whether it's China or Iran or North Korea.
They have oftentimes had the opposite effect, actually. In 1941, FDR agreed to the decision of a lower official to basically ratchet up economic war against the Japanese, and that led to their attack on Pearl Harbor, something Roosevelt did not anticipate and sure did not intend when he tried that.
And finally, Michael, what about the cabinet? If you go through history, how important has it been that the cabinet be behind the president? Because even right now with President Trump, we hear various accounts, even just over the weekend, he's saying, well, I don't know whether Mr. General Mattis will stay over defense or not. How important is that the cabinet really be behind the president when it comes to conflict?
Advisor is absolutely crucial. 1962, John Kennedy, as you know, was dealing with these nuclear missiles that Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviets had put in Cuba. He went into this group called EXCOM, Executive Committee, that he had formed, including the Joint Chiefs of Staff. At the beginning of the week that they were considering what to do, almost everyone in that room were telling Kennedy, bomb the missile sites, go in and invade Cuba. We now know in retrospect from history, had he done that, there were presumably nuclear-tipped missiles on Cuba. The Soviet officers had been told to fire. The result would have been very quickly a nuclear war that could have killed 60 million people in history. Would that have been worth it? Was that so important, who ruled Cuba, that we would have seen much of the Northern Hemisphere incinerated?